So it's my great pleasure to introduce Ron Peterson. He's the Executive Vice President of Johns Hopkins Medical School and former President of the hospital. If you get a chance to read his bio, I suggest...
That's a different Ron Peterson.
You're kidding.
Yeah. It's true. It's true. Ron Peterson is the president of the hospital, has been at Johns Hopkins. However, different
unfortunately,
cowboy.
that Ron Peterson was unable to join us, so we're doing second best with this guy.
This is the story of my life, actually.
Okay.
That darn internet, you know, you just Google somebody like that, and that's what happens. It's true. Yeah, I wish I were president of Johns Hopkins Hospital, but not so much. No. So I'm Ron Peterson from the Mayo Clinic, a neurologist, and as Ken has mentioned already, I lead the Mayo Clinic Study of Aging and the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center there. I'm not going to talk about any of that this morning. My task this morning is to talk about where, I'll say the country is, but where we are with regard to a U.S. national plan for Alzheimer's disease. So heaven forbid talking about politics, but in fact, it is an interesting journey, and I want to thank Sanjay for the kind invitation to participate, and as he always does, I want up-to-date stuff. So, in fact, I came from Washington yesterday where we had our last meeting of the Advisory Council for the National Plan. So, it's an interesting story of how the national government has responded at least to one issue, one hot topic out there, and I think there's some good news and then there's some questionable news about this. This is for Dr. Page, and I apologize all the reasons that I'm conflicted here, but I generally work on clinical trials for several companies developing biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. But the real disclosure, and crazy as it sounds, I have to say this, I'm not representing the United States government. I'm not representing the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm not representing the Advisory Council for the National Plan. I'm here just as a private citizen with regard to that. True story. So what is the National Alzheimer's Project Act? Well, Congress passed this unanimously back in 2010, and the President signed it into law immediately in 2011. And part of the law was to establish an advisory council to help the Secretary for Health and Human Services how to develop a plan and how to work on it. And the first plan then was published in 2012. The law requires that it be updated annually, and it's still going on. In 2015, again by law, part of the Advisory Council turns over every 2 years. The plan was published in 2016. That's the existing plan right now. And something I'll say a couple words about a little bit later is that toward the end of this year, there's actually going to be a research summit on care and services. While most of the focus has been on research in biomedical sense, there's going to be a care and services summit as well. So it's the National Alzheimer's Plan, but in fact it includes other dementing disorders, namely dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal degeneration, and vascular cognitive impairment as well. So what is it all about? The law requires then that the Secretary of Health and Human Services develop a plan, the first national plan for this country, mainly to coordinate what's going on in the federal government and also project where the needs are. One of the benefits of the plan right from the get-go was the fact that many agencies within the federal government were working on Alzheimer's disease and didn't know the guys next door were doing the same thing. So it has, in fact, coordinated and served as an inventory of what's going on. Ideally, of course, we need to accelerate treatments and help for this disease, including early diagnosis, coordinating care and treatment, like we're talking about later on this year, ethnic and racial disparity issues, and then coordinate with international activities as well. So here's what the plan looks like. This was the first plan published in 2012. Each successive year has been similar appearance. That's the website to keep up on what's happening. The overall goal is to do something, but by 2025, that is actually put a stake in the ground and say by 2025 we really need to make progress, and here's how we're going to do it. We'll effectively treat the disease. Now, In reality, I think treat is delay the onset, slow the progression. I doubt we're going to prevent Alzheimer's disease or many other major chronic illnesses, but nevertheless, this would have a huge impact on the disease. The plan is focused around 5 goals. The first one being the research goal I just mentioned. The second being care, clinical care, early diagnosis, issues that clinicians may attend to. The third one is to expand support for families, services for caregivers and the like. The fourth one is education and awareness. Fifth has to do with metrics. How are we going to measure what we're doing? Now, the law said that's the plan, and the plan will be published and revised each year. But interestingly, the law also said that the Advisory Council will generate recommendations independent of the federal government. That is, the plan is somewhat constrained by the current budgetary considerations of the various agencies. So they have to kind of work within what they've been given. It's still been very effective, but if you want to expand, if you really want to stretch your wings and say, where should this go in the country, you're going to need the recommendations. So, in fact, the recommendations are generated each year by the council. They go directly to the secretary to help him or her deal with the plan revision for that year, and then they go directly to Congress. And yesterday's meeting was the spring meeting where we generated the recommendations for 2017. Again, during the Q&A, we can talk about what those are if you'd like. But one of the most important recommendations that has come forward is this number, $2 billion. That is, this has been the number that's been put forth by the Council to Congress, to the Secretary, as an estimate of what the research budget ought to be to achieve the goal of the plan by 2025. And again, we can get into the details of how that came about and how that's being revised. But this has been sort of a focal point of the plan and the recommendations going forward. Now, within the research domain, we've tried to be a little bit more specific, again, just giving generalizations, but what are the research priorities for the country, and what are the milestones to measure whether we're getting there? We're focusing on prevention, treatment, because this is a public health issue. We're going to have to treat the disease early on, hopefully prevent it. Accelerate efforts to identify early and pre-symptomatic. Again, the public health perception of this disease is late-stage Alzheimer's disease where people are impaired, unable to perform their daily activities, when in fact we have to move much earlier in the disease spectrum. Coordinate research with international activities that are ongoing, such as the World Dementia Council, the World Health Organization, where Dr. Langer was a few years ago, and then facilitate translation of the findings into medical practice. I think this is particularly important, and a charge to the committee to really make this practical rather than just a blue sky event. Now, with the annual revision, there are also metrics that are put out there. That is, we measure the progress of how the federal government has done in the preceding year. And I'm just using 2013 as an example of, one could say, oh, this is just another white paper, okay? It's very good, great, gets a little bit of publicity, goes on the shelf, and that's it. In fact, I think the plan has been more successful than that, and I'd like to lay out a little bit of that for you. So in 2013, we asked the federal agencies to describe not only the direction they're going, but what would be the measurable milestones, and put some time frame on those. Excuse me. So, to establish the milestones, the plan then laid out the goals, the big goals, the overall goals, and asked what the public thought about the goals. They were then translated into specific milestones to implement recommendations that came out of this. And how can we focus on research opportunities? The so-called IDROP, which is the International Alzheimer's Disease Research Portfolio, was put into place to sort of survey who's doing what in this field, inside the federal government, outside the federal government. Where is the funding? Are there any gaps, areas that need to be covered that the funding is not addressing? And then, again, prepare an annual progress report. So don't read this, don't worry about it, but this is the kind of the language of a particular a recommendation that comes out. This is related to drug trial milestones. So again, do people take this seriously? Absolutely. Program staff at NIA takes each one of these recommendations, each one of these milestones, puts it into very specific goals. Okay, let's take one. Initiate phase 2 proof of concept drug trials for agents against 3 to 6 currently known therapeutic agents. Very specific, and puts a time frame out there as to how that might be accomplished, when might it be accomplished. This enables then the agencies to say, are we there? Have we made progress? Check that one off. Or no, we're not there. And if we're not there, why are we not there? Is it funding? Is it personnel? Whatever. So again, these drill down to very, very specific recommendations. So has this had an impact? Has the national plan? Now, I'm not saying that the national plan has been solely responsible for any funding changes that have occurred since the onset of the plan, but I think it certainly has raised the awareness of this in Congress and among the general public. So here's where the funding levels for Alzheimer's disease and related disorders research would have been had it not been for the national plan. So started back in 2011, about 448 million. Basically flat over the next several years, looking at the trends. So in 2012, basically nothing happened, but in Francis Collins, director of NIH, actually found or repurposed $50 million, $56 million of funds that he could say, let's focus on Alzheimer's disease, take these budgeted funds, put them towards Alzheimer's disease. 2013, sequestration, everything was heading south. All federal budgets were going down. Francis Collins, Dr. Richard Hodis at the National Institute on Aging went into their discretionary budgets and said, we can't allow this to happen for Alzheimer's disease. So pulled a few bucks out here, kept it at least somewhat level. Similarly, in 2014, they were able to find another 125 million for Alzheimer's disease. So we're increasing the base all along. And in 2015, another 195 million. So you can see it's creeping up. And again, this is in the setting of budgets in general for federal activity going in the other direction. And then the real boost came in FY16. FY16, there we are. Lights went out. FY16, an extra $350 million for Alzheimer's disease research, bringing us to 991. And if it breaks out into Alzheimer's disease, the purple part, and then the gold part at the top is related disorders, FTD, DLB, and the like. So if you're an optimist, you say, well, look, the plan began back in 2011, and it's essentially doubled over that time frame, again, while there's been uncertainty at the federal government level. So it certainly has had an impact, but remember, our goal was $2 billion, so this is even short of $1 billion. Nevertheless, it's a doubling out there. Now, the optimistic news earlier this year, I won't get into political discussions, but the optimistic note was that the Appropriations Subcommittee of the House recommended an additional $400 million for FY17. The Senate recommended $450 million new dollars, so for FY17. Of course, there is no FY17 budget. We're still in a continuing resolution. And as of yesterday, from the people who know about this, it was still uncertain as to what's going to happen. During the Q&A, again, we could talk about what are the implications if we go forward with a continuing resolution, if in fact an FY17 budget is generated. What about the President's recommendation of an almost 20% cut to NIH? What's that going to mean going forward? So a lot of scenarios. The true bottom line is nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. So another way to look at these figures, again, Napa's signed there, and here's what's happened since. So again, I don't think it was totally a function of the national plan, but I think the national plan served to focus everybody's attention and appropriately concern, as Ken laid out earlier, not only the numbers of the disease, but the cost of the disease to society. So, summarizing then, again, in 2012, the first plan was published. That led to one of the first summits. So there have been summits, research summits held along the way, 2 for Alzheimer's disease, 2 for Alzheimer's disease-related disorders, and as I mentioned, there will be a Care and Services Summit later this year. There was also a Down Syndrome Summit along the way. So the point of the summits is, again, not just everybody gets together and talks and goes home, but in fact, after each summit, a committee sat down, took the recommendations generated from each session of the summit, translated those into the final recommendations, transmitted that to the National Institute on Aging. The staff there took those recommendations, put them in the form of concepts, research concepts. Those concepts are presented to NIA Council, and the Council says yes or no. The ones that are approved then are translated into funding opportunity announcement, FOAs, and to RFAs. So the summits, in fact, translate into funding opportunities contingent upon those budgetary figures, of course. So the fact of the matter is these have a real implication. 2013 then was the first Related Disorders Summit. It was similarly translated into recommendations, milestones, and RFAs came out of that. In 2014, the Alzheimer's Accountability Act was passed. Now, this was an interesting piece of legislation that required the National Institutes of Health, primarily NIA, NINDS, to generate a budget asking the question, how much is it going to cost in the next year to get to the 2025 goal of the plan? So each year then, the NIH program officials sit down and generate what's called a bypass budget, because this is a budget that goes straight forward without any editing. And so for FY17, the recommendation has been $413 million new dollars. Interestingly, the House and the Senate say 450. So everybody's talking about the same types of numbers. If that were to become true, in fact, then we would have the total funding up to about $1.3 billion on the way to the $2 billion goal. So the Alzheimer's Accountability Act was particularly important at, again, stimulating the conversation as to what it would take to get to the goal. 2015 then, the second Alzheimer's Disease Summit was held. Same kind of process, milestones, recommendations, RFAs, etc. And in 2016, the second Related Disorders Summit was held. Similar type of process. The FY17 recommendation for the bypass budget was $323 million. They're generating the FY18 was the one I just mentioned at 414, and right now they're working on the bypass budget for fiscal 19, actually. So getting ahead of the game. Again, these are the summits and how important the summits have been in terms of actually operationalizing the recommendations out of the national plan. This is the way, in fact, it has come down to translate into real science opportunities, and real funding opportunities. As I mentioned, what has happened over the last 5+ years or so, there's been a lot of focus on the Advisory Council on this research aspect. That's important, but there are 4 other goals, of course, and important goals on clinical care and on services and support. So with that as an impetus, about a year ago, a task force was assembled to put together this summit. So insofar as it's going to be October 16, 17 this year in Washington NIH campus. So if that's of interest to you on the care and services side, please keep an eye out for that website. So that's now I'll turn to a little bit of a, not a political statement, but a little bit of a broader conceptualization of where we are, aging, cognitive impairment, dementias. Ken alluded to this a little bit. I think at the end of the day, we're going to be talking about not so much just Alzheimer's disease, but we're going to be talking about a broader array of neurodegenerative processes and what's going on in the brain. So if you look at a clinical spectrum, and this is just one, but a clinical continuum of normal cognition to something in between, call it mild cognitive impairment, call it whatever you want, into dementia, that clinicians will make sort of the syndromic diagnosis along this type of a spectrum. So we have the clinical spectrum in the middle. Then the next question, as we do in medicine, is we've got the syndrome. We ask the next question, what's causing it? What is the etiology? What is it due to? And here's where the field is moving toward, of course, biomarkers. So A-beta, amyloid, one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease itself. We can measure it pretty well now in living patients with PET scanning, spinal fluid assessments, et cetera. The other hallmark of the disease, the tau protein, okay? Tau is contributing to the overall clinical picture as well. We can measure that with PET scanning. We can measure that cerebrospinal fluid. We'd like blood markers, not there yet. But this isn't the whole picture. We have other proteins that are as active as tau and amyloid. Alpha-synuclein, the one that causes Lewy body dementia, Parkinsonism. Alpha-synuclein occurs in 30–40% of people with clinical Alzheimer's disease. TDP-43, another protein that's been identified as having a definite effect on cognition. One of my colleagues did a study a couple of years ago looking at our brain bank, holding constant the amyloid load, holding constant the tau load, and correlating TDP-43 density with clinical impairment, and found a very strong relationship. So no doubt in some people TDP-43 contributes to the total clinical picture. Vascular disease, of course. Major vascular, minor vascular vessel disease absolutely contributes and may even interact. And these are not necessarily independent of each other. There's probably interactions and synergistic effects. And I'm sure there are other factors that we haven't even appreciated yet. So this is most likely the explanation of a person's cognitive impairment as one goes down the aging spectrum. What do we do about that? We take these putative underlying pathophysiologic explanations and generate biomarkers for each one of them. So again, A-beta, we're pretty well off. Tau, we're reasonably well off. Vascular disease, have some pretty good signals there. We need to work on alpha-synuclein, TDP-43, and the others. Why do we want to go down this road? Because ultimately, we'd like to develop therapies. And the therapies will be tailored by an individual's profile of underlying pathophysiology. So a 78-year-old person with a moderate degree of cognitive impairment, if we got a biomarker profile of that individual, we might in fact be able to tailor therapies specifically for that person. Like we do in HIV/AIDS, like we do in hypertension, cancer, many other diseases, we use combination therapy. I think that's where we're going to be. Again, there are a lot of political issues. Alzheimer's disease is only part of the spectrum, very important part of the spectrum, but I think just a component of aging and cognitive impairment as we go down the road. So let me stop there. And again, thanks, Sanjay, for the kind invitation. I'd be happy to chat later on during the Q&A. Thanks very much.